In this video, I'll be sharing my entire Inktense pencil painting process that I find gives me the best results one could hope for with such fun art supplies. I'll be drawing and painting simple shapes and breaking down every technique that I use step by step. And with that, I know that this video is going to be helpful because it will be easier for you to take what you've learned from this easy tutorial and to apply it to other subjects like I've been doing. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. Here I teach everything watercolors and water soluble, and you can learn with me on Patreon, Skillshare, and my art school over on my website, and I'll link all of that in the description of this video. First off, I want to tell you about a tool that I think will help you greatly with Inktense pencils and even any water soluble pencil. And then we'll touch on the process and all the techniques that I use. Paper is the first thing to affect what your Inktense pencil painting experience and outcome will be like. That's why I'll be using this Zeta sketchbook by Stillman & Byrne, and I'll explain why while I'm getting ready to swatch my 100 pencil set, since I didn't get a chance to do it properly before. This Zeta sketchbook paper is a heavyweight and smooth paper that is fit for dry and wet media according to the brand. And when you look at it closely, it is smooth but not glossy or slippery to the touch. It has a little bit of texture, subtle hills and valleys on the surface, and that is perfect for Inktense pencils to grab onto the paper without leaving these nasty lines most of us dislike about them. And I'll share more about how to get a smooth finish later on. With practice, I came to the conclusion that these papers are much better than the quality and pricey 100% cotton cold press watercolor papers that I used to pair my pencils with. Although don't get me wrong, I think they're still a great supply to use. So if you have them or any other type of paper, don't let it stop you and please use that. And when it comes to watercolor sketchbooks, I honestly think that 95% of them perform very badly with traditional watercolor, and it's even more obvious when the wet and wet technique is involved. I know a lot of you in the watercolor community have noticed that about watercolor sketchbooks, but let me know in the comments. And as to me, I can't even tell you how much money I have spent on sketchbooks and how many pages I've wasted, only because I cannot make a watercolor painting look decent in them. But lately, I've been sketchbooking again because I found that water-soluble pencils look stunning in sketchbooks when used right, and that is true for the Inktense pencils too, as you're about to see. And I think that the first reason that is there's something in the binder of these pencils that makes them slightly chalky compared to watercolors in a way, and thus more fit for sketchbook papers. And the other reason is that overall, they also require a lot less water than traditional watercolors do. My pet peeve with watercolor sketchbooks is that they cannot handle water most of the time, so that's when the pencils are a great fit, I think. And you can see from these swatches too, colors also look punchy on this sketchbook, vibrant, while I found that my Inktense look less glamorous on other papers, as if because they're so great with water, they suck a little bit of that pigment in. I even tested the Inktense paper itself in another video recently. I'll link it down below. And it's a great paper, but it feels different and it yields different results. So we always come back to that idea that the best thing to do is to experiment with our supplies to find what works best for us. I'm just sharing what works best for me, and I really love those sketchbooks with the Inktense pencils. I am not a fan of the lines that water-soluble pencils leave after we activate them, and it's especially true with Inktense pencils. But with the techniques that I'm going to show you here, the coloring techniques that I use, I'm able to get the smoothest look possible in combination to that paper especially. But even if you use another paper, it will work well enough, so please don't get discouraged if you don't have exactly what I'm using today. First off, I have found that a blunt lead is better than a sharp one. That's why I only sharpen my pencils to a fine point if I need to draw precise details. A big thing with Inktense pencils and similar products is that they can be activated with water. That's why the water will do the work a sharp lead would by getting into the nooks and crannies of the paper. So that's the first reason why I use blunt leads. I also find it's faster to color if the lead is blunt, and it's also less prone to making sharp lines that won't easily go away later when we add water because they've indented the paper. Here I ran into a problem where the violet pencil was giving me a hard time. For some reason, it felt a bit harsh to color with. So since I had never used that one yet, it was brand new, I assumed that was the problem. So I sharpened it to get rid of whatever might cause this and start fresh. And I had to be even more cautious with the coloring until the lead became more blunt. Also, why in combination to a blunt lead, try and use light pressure when coloring. How it feels like is barely touching the paper, especially in the early stage when the paper is blank. The more I overlap and add to an existing base to make it smooth and even, the more I'll press, but overall the touch is still going to be light. To make sure that the coloring and blending will be smooth, I also use circular motions, and I know that it might not be obvious here because my motions are more like large oval ones, and it makes it look like I do a back and forth motion, but it's still oval shaped, if that makes sense. Remember here, the violet pencil gave me a hard time, so when that's the case, if a pencil feels a bit dry compared to another, or maybe you've sharpened it too much, feel free to overlap more pigment onto what's been done already. In general, this will help you make sure that the finish is smoother, more consistent everywhere. And for this particular shape, I found it helpful to color vertically after coloring horizontally. That's why we start with a light touch in the first place. That's why it's so important, because it gives us the room that we need to add more and more pigment and to fill more of the little gaps in the paper, or just fix a coloring that has those start and stop points showing. So remember still that the water will help us fill out any remaining specks of paper and smooth this out even better. So with Inktense pencils and water-soluble pencils, it is not necessary to be as careful as we would with a regular colored pencil coloring. And in general, what I've noticed is that it does not take long to color with water-soluble pencils compared to colored pencils. It's really fast. Another big thing that I do to get the most out of a coloring with the Inktense is to follow the curves of my object, especially when it's a round one like this cylinder shape here. And I touched on that on a watercolor pencil video recently that I'll link below. That's really important too, and it will help whatever it is you're painting to look more realistic later. So imagine you're painting on the real thing and try and mimic the movement you would need to follow if you were. Here, for example, I use these curvy strokes to render the shape for this cylinder, and I applied the principle to the other two shapes with round strokes on the circle and straighter ones on the cube. Before we move on to the painting techniques, because these are super important as well, just a reminder that this tutorial is available on my Patreon in real time with the voiceover, and you can learn even more with me over there when it comes to water-soluble pencils and Inktense. In the way that I use watercolor pencils, water-soluble pencils, Inktense pencils to make my art realistic, I always see what the painting is going to look like when the coloring is done. And in fact, activating the pigment with water will only enhance the colors and turn this pencil drawing into a painting, but the overall aspect is going to remain similar. That's why coloring techniques are so important. But now there's a way to activate the pigment that will enhance all the work you've done before without messing it all up. A technique I already touched on this channel to activate water-soluble pencils properly is to work with little water and a paper towel. And that's why I get rid of the excess water here. Then I start wetting these white areas first and then the colored areas. so that the color melts into the white parts of the paper flawlessly and create a nice gradient. And notice that at this point, I am still following the curve of the object with the brush. Another crucial thing to do, where a lot of people get stuck actually, is to rinse your paintbrush frequently because we've added the necessary amount of pigment everywhere on the drawing already, which means that we do not need more from the brush to come spoil the coloring. And that's why it's better to blend a small section, rinse the brush, get rid of the excess of water, and move on to another section of the art. Sometimes if the paint dries too fast in one spot and you're seeing a separation between this part and the one nearby instead of a solid and smooth layer of color, and you're working on a small surface like I am now, it can be really helpful to just move the pigment around with your paintbrush to re-wet everything and smooth everything out right there with the paintbrush directly, and you see me do it here. When it's all wet, the color or colors that you've added have no choice but merging together, and that's why it can be a good option on a small scale. Now on the large scale, we'd be using a completely different technique, and I'm not touching on that in this video, but you'll see it done on all my other water-soluble paintings that are landscapes, because these have backgrounds that cover more ground. So when you move the pigment around, just be careful not to do a whole bunch of back and forth for a long time, just because there's a chance that the paint starts to lift off the page at some point. So in other words, you want to do that pretty quickly. In the cylinder again, you can see that I start with the top because it is so much lighter, and I blend the paint while following the curve of the object still. Before moving on to the finishing touches, and again, these are extremely important, you're going to notice a difference right away. It's nice to make sure that your painting is completely dry, so I use my heat gun. You can use a hairdryer if you like. We could decide at this point that the art looks great and that we're done, but if you finish watching the video and then you come back to this point and you compare, you're going to see that continuing to work on the painting makes a huge difference. And that is all because of the finishing touches. In other terms, the shadows and the highlights. And I like to include a darker color at this point in the painting, and I chose brown here because it will be great for all three colors I used before. If I had used black or gray, I would have been a little bit afraid to make this golden sphere a bit dull or to ruin it with too strong of a transition between colors, because it's such a bright and light color in the first place. For violet and blue, it's a little bit different because they're stronger already and they can handle something like black a little better, I think. So that's why I chose brown, but I could have picked something else. Here, it's important to layer your shadow color on top of the painting. I'm careful not to overdo it with a bright color like gold. That's why I only press harder on the sides where the shadow is more pronounced, and I barely touch the paper elsewhere. And if you're wondering how I know where to add the shadows, where to press more or less, I'm working on a reference photo, so I observe, I really look at where the picture looks darker to me and where it looks lighter. A technique that I use to make sure that the blending will look good and natural is to overlap my original color, gold, on top of the shadow color. It blends this addition into the existing painting already a little bit before we even add water. And it also helps with a softer gradient between the blended gold areas and the brown additions. And it softens the brown color into something that's going to be a bit lighter, but still dark enough to make it a shadow, thanks to the addition of more gold into it. With the purple color, since it's already quite dark, I don't think it's as important to overlap more purple on top of the brown color. Blue, however, appears to me that it's light enough compared to the violet color that I decided to overlap it on top of brown, just in case, to keep that shadow addition visible, but also natural enough that it looks realistic. And now, this is where it's a good time to work with a sharp lead and some amount of pressure, because this helps with creating final details. Here, for example, it helps enhance different edges in the shapes. and also the creases and pockets of shadows underneath the cube and the cylinder. I won't go over the full process of how I activate the paint because it's the same again than what we did before. But you still want to remember here in this step to rinse your paintbrush after activating a shadow so you don't transfer those darker tones elsewhere. That would be the important thing to remember here. This painting looks finished, but white Inktense pencils and white water-soluble pencils have a use here. And notice how, with a sharp lead and some pressure, I'm able to highlight small parts in these shapes and even get them to pop more against one another. That's proof that it really doesn't take much at all to achieve that when you keep these techniques in mind and practice this step by step. So see you on Patreon if you want to do so along with me. Otherwise, I can suggest this video here if you want to have a bigger picture on how I use the Inktense pencils wet in wet as well. And of course, I have plenty more videos for you in the watercolor pencil playlist by now, so have fun learning and practicing. Thank you so much for watching, sticking around till the end, and see you next time.